Mr. Deputy Speaker, on 15 February 1942, General Percival met his fellow generals at Fort Canning. Bukit Timah has fallen, along with crucial military supplies. The water supply was at the verge of collapse. Thousands of soldiers wandered aimlessly through the city, dazed and confused. Collectively, the generals decided that counterattack was impossible. They went against their orders. To fight to the last man, they decided to surrender. The surrender marked one of the biggest military defeats in British history and a big military mystery. How could the British, after 20 years of planning for Singapore's defense with an army of 130,000 troops, be defeated by a Japanese army of roughly one-third of its size? As we commemorate our bicentennial, it's a good time to reflect on history. A close read of history shows that Singapore was lost not on the defense in the battles of 1941. Singapore was lost on the planning tables since 1921. After World War I, the British Empire was stretched financially. The British returned to their gold standards at a high exchange rate, which triggered deflationary monetary and fiscal policies, which did not adjust downwards due to union pressure, and the British exports became expensive. For most of the 1920s, the British suffered a depression. The British military defense budget was cut very deeply until 1935, and her military failed to modernize. And after World War I, America and Japan competed for dominance in Asia. In 1922, America forced the British to choose a side. The British chose to side America over Japan, its former ally, and with that, Britain faced a dangerous Japan with a formidable navy. Despite her military weakness, the British must convince Australia and India, then part of the British Empire, that the Far East can be secured, especially so since the Australian and Indian troops were needed to protect the Empire's interests in Europe and Middle East. Yet the British could not afford a Far East navy to counter the Japan. To make the impossible possible, the British came up with the Singapore strategy. In the event of a future world war, Britain would concentrate its entire navy to defeat its European enemies and then sail the main fleet down to Singapore to counter the Japanese. Therefore, in 1921, the British cabinet approved the building of a new naval base out of Singapore to host its main fleet, and Singapore must be defended until the arrival of that fleet. The idea was sound, but the implementation of the Singapore strategy over the next 2 decades can only be described as fundamentally unsound, as a 20-year sleepwalk towards disaster. First, according to the historian Brian Farrell, the British never found the money to build a big naval base. The British knew that they need most, if not all, of their fleet to come to contend with the Japanese. But surprisingly, the naval base in Singapore was never designed to hold more than 20% of its fleet. Secondly, knowing that there's no fleet in Far East, and knowing that they needed to defend Malaya and Singapore from a land invasion from the north, in 1936, the British turned to their Air Force. Unfortunately, the British Air Defence Plan was fundamentally unsound as well. The British Air Force built a string of air bases to the north without consulting their army. While these air bases were close to the South China Sea and the Thai border, areas they expected the Japanese to invade from, they were situated in indefensible terrain. And after all this hassle, the British incredibly never found the money to deploy an air force large or sophisticated enough. All this meant that the understrength British Army now had to defend not just the empty naval base in Singapore in the south, but also the under-equipped Air Force base in the north. In short, the Singapore strategy was nothing more than a strategic illusion, a plan that could never work against a determined enemy, a plan one hopes will never be tested. But hope is not a strategy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the British stood alone in Malaya and in Singapore. In the final years before the Japanese invasion, the British did build up the Malayan army to almost 3 times the size of the invading Japanese army. But decades are needed to build and sustain a strong defense. and many historians, including Frank Pike, concluded that the large British Malayan army was only capable of fighting fixed peace battles of World War I. And while there are some good units, even the British official historian Woodward Kirby concluded that most of these units were raw and unfamiliar with how to fight in the tropics. Lastly, the British Army lacked comprehensive intelligence on the Japanese and therefore were complacent. In December 1941, when the Japanese swept down from the north, they destroyed the small obsolete British Air Force in the north within 100 hours and sank the only 2 major British ships in the Far East. They then proceeded to destroy the British Army dispersed throughout Malaya piecemeal. They defeated the British at Jitra to win northern Malaya. They overran and dispersed the British at Slim River. They outmaneuvered the British at Muar to win the crucial fight for Johor, and they reached the gates of Singapore all within 55 days. After a 7-day fight for Singapore, the divided and demoralized British Army, still 100,000 men strong, chose to surrender. So what can we learn from the fall of Singapore? The obvious answer is that we can only count on ourselves to defend Singapore, regardless of security arrangements with others. But there are at least 3 other lessons. The first lesson is sustained and sufficient defense spending is necessary. In the case of the British Empire after World War I, they faced a rapidly changing world order with the rise of Japan and Germany. The rise of air power, use of combined arms, shift from battleships to carriers, all require major investments. And when the British woke up to the reality in the mid-1930s, it was too late to reverse 2 decades of military neglect. The situation for Singapore today is vastly different, but some lessons are still worth noting. The most advanced militaries today grapple with major challenges such as adapting to 5th-generation aerial warfare, contending with cyber and hybrid warfare, dealing with disruptive innovations from drones to AI. These require major and sustained investments. Therefore, I'm heartened that 30% of our budget this year goes to defense, security, and diplomacy, because history shows there's no substitute to deterrence. The second lesson is, a nation's security depends on a strong economy and ample fiscal resources to deal with the changing world. In the case of the British Empire, while it thrived in the first industrial revolutions of steam engines and weaving looms, it failed to transform its economy and fell behind America and Germany in the second industrial revolution of chemicals and cars. Its misguided monetary and fiscal policy led to deflation and depression. It accumulated significant debts because of World War I. For an empire where the sun never sets, it never built a diverse and sustainable tax base to pay for its defense. In short, the world changed dramatically for the British Empire, but it ran out of money to adapt to the changing world. That was then. How about our world today? Henry Kissinger recently said, "We are in a very, very grave period for the world, and the current times can only be marked as an end of an era." I'm more optimistic. While there are major global uncertainties ahead, there are ample opportunities for a nimble Singapore. But this requires us to sustain our economy and then maintain our fiscal discipline. We're in good shape today. The past year's GDP growth is strong, unemployment and inflation are both low, and median wage increases is high. But what about our economy in 10 years' time? No one can guarantee that our companies can continue to thrive in the face of technology disruption and global competition. Therefore, our companies and people must tap on various programs and grants and press on relentlessly to transform. On maintaining fiscal discipline, there are many voices asking for more government spending and to deeper into our reserve income. Many of them are for deserving causes. But our reserves must anchor our economy through turbulent times. If we fail to grow our savings over time, when a major storm hits Singapore a decade or 2 down the road, we may find our financial anchor insufficient to stabilize our economy, which will have grown larger by then. At the same time, in this House, we frequently said that we are not done building Singapore. But as non-discretionary spending forms a larger percentage of our budget, there's less room for major shifts to respond to a changing world, less room to build a better Singapore across generations. The third and final lesson is, a successful society requires its people to have shared beliefs rooted on reality. The British Empire had an unworkable defense plan. Over 2 decades, her electorate and leaders failed to robustly debate on whether it was realistic and whether there were sufficient resources to backstop the plan. Singapore's success to date depends on our people's consensus on what it takes for Singapore to succeed. But the world is increasingly diverse, and our people's view mirrors this increasing diversity. To meet tomorrow's challenges, we need to strengthen our shared belief in many areas. For example, how can we balance giving our youth with the best we can afford while ensuring they remain hungry and curious for new opportunities? How can we persuade our people that keeping Singapore open to the world is to our best collective interests? How can we continue the unfinished business of tackling inequality while maintaining the core promise of meritocracy? How can we best represent the causes and values of some while enlarging the common space for all? The answer lies in more robust conversations not just between the government and the people, but also between people of differing viewpoints. I hope our government can foster more conversations for our people to air their views, listen to different opinions, understand the realities that constrain Singapore, and achieve a nuanced and shared understanding of our common future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to conclude, the commemoration of our bicentennial allows us to reflect on the fall of Singapore in 1942. Singapore today is safe and prosperous. Nevertheless, there's a Chinese saying, 居安思危. Even in peace and prosperity, it's essential to plan for and act on the turbulence and uncertainty ahead. Budget 2019 is best described by the same phrase, 居安思危. With that, I stand in support of the budget. Thank you.